Hi, this is Ron Davis, and on behalf of the National Burglar and Fire Alarm Association, we are sitting here with an attorney. And you're going to wonder why we would have an attorney to interview in this series of videos, and I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. But first, I want to introduce Bryan Lawrence, who is arguably one of the top attorneys in this industry, or for that matter, any industry. Bryan, welcome to this video presentation being presented by the NBFAA.
Thanks, Ron. Nice to be
I'm
here.
glad you're here. And the firm that you were with is Buchanan, Ingersoll?
Buchanan, Ingersoll, and Rooney.
I knew there was another "and" in there. And what do you do in the firm?
I am part of our security alarm practice. We have a group of about 10 to 15 lawyers that represent clients in the alarm industry. We represent the NBFAA, for example, but we also represent a number of people involved in contracts, but also involved in buying and selling alarm companies and financing alarm companies. Really kind of the whole range of something that anybody involved in the alarm industry in any of those functions would be interested in doing or needing to do from a legal standpoint.
And you might wonder why we're sitting together, and the answer to that is very simply, I asked you to be here. So let's start with the things that you do that would help a typical alarm dealer. Why would an alarm dealer want to call a lawyer unless he was being sued or had some other kind of legal problem?
Well, great question. I think the first thing that if people could understand anything, it's a lot cheaper to get involved with or get a lawyer involved at the beginning of the process rather than at the end of a process. And while you can always call a lawyer if you're involved in a lawsuit or you've had some other problem come up, that's always going to be an expensive proposition, where it's often much less expensive, although it requires some foresight, to get a lawyer involved at the beginning of the process. And one of the best things to do that with are contracts. Because in this industry, because of the potential liability issues out there, because of the nature of what people are doing in terms of securing property and people, it's very important that they have contracts that protect them in situations where things don't go exactly as everyone had planned.
Do alarm dealers really get sued because of contract issues?
Well, not as much as people might think. But the old story I've heard is it's like climbing Mount Everest and you're going across one of the crevasses, and the odds of you falling in are very small, but it's a long way down.
And you certainly don't want to have that debate going down.
And you don't want to be thinking, gee, I should have done this or been a little more careful crossing it as you were falling. So the old adage about a pound of prevention, or yes.
I understand where it is that you're going. And we happen to agree with you, which is one of the reasons I invited you.
There are a number of reasons to have a contract. One is just the ability to make it clear what the roles are and responsibilities are between you, the alarm company, and you, the customer. The second reason that you ought to have a contract is that it lets you sleep better at night, knowing that you are protected in the event that you have something go wrong. And yes, you may have insurance, but very likely the insurance company is going to require you, if it's a reputable insurance company that knows the industry, they're going to require you to have a contract. And so if you really want to be able to sleep well at night, you need to have a contract both to protect you and get your insurance company comfortable. But one of the other reasons, and this is something that's not focused on as much, is what are you going to do when you retire? Because at some point, unless you're passing the business on to a family member or an employee, if you're going to sell it to a third party, you're going to get either no deal or a very reduced deal in terms of the price you get if you don't have contracts, because that buyer is not going to be interested in buying your company without contracts, or at least not at a reduced rate, because they're not going to be able to finance it. They're not going to be able to come up with the money to pay you unless you have good contracts in place.
What advice would you give alarm dealers about incorporation versus other ways of starting a business?
Well, there are several basic ways that you can go about doing things. One is to be what's called a sole proprietor, where you're basically the individual that is the business, and there's really no difference between your business and what you have in your personal bank account. You may have a name under which you're doing business or trading as, but it's still you doing things on your own. The problem with that, just like with contracts, is the potential liability that attaches to that. And so it's very helpful from a liability standpoint for you to create some entity that's going to limit your liability. That can be a corporation, that can be a partnership with someone, that can be what the new thing recently or in the last 10 or 15 years are what are known as limited liability companies. But the common theme in all of these things, and these are ultimately tax issues more than anything in terms of which of these structures you might choose, but the one thing, the common theme that they all have in common is that they're going to limit your liability in the event the business goes bankrupt, for example. Hopefully that obviously doesn't happen, but if it does, you have the ability to potentially have the business go bankrupt without it subjecting all of your own personal assets to bankruptcy as well.
An interesting observation there. In all the years I've been in the industry, I'm only aware of maybe a dozen or so bankruptcies, which kind of indicates that the industry is pretty solid, or at least the memberships within it. Let's shift gears for just a second. I'm an alarm dealer, been in business for 10 years, got a couple thousand accounts, or 1,000, somewhere in there, and I want to put together an advisory board. Is that a good idea?
I think it's an excellent idea.
And what role would a lawyer play in an advisory board?
Well, I think it's twofold. I think the obvious answer is that the lawyer could advise you on a lot of legal questions that you might not have otherwise thought of, but as your company grows and becomes more sophisticated and involved in more things, they might advise you on hiring practices, they might advise you on contracts, they might advise you on various other employment issues or financing issues, acquisitions, how you might exit the business. So there are all kinds of things that lawyers can advise you on, but the other thing that it's real helpful is if you have a lawyer that actually knows this industry, because that lawyer can then act not just as a lawyer, but almost as a consultant.
Last question. If you had just one piece of advice that you could offer somebody just coming into the industry and is looking around and says, boy, what do I do first? What would your advice be?
I think the first thing that you do is you get good contracts from a legal standpoint. I mean, there are lots of other good business things to do, but from a legal standpoint, get good contracts, understand what the risks are to this business, and how you can go about protecting yourself of the risk. And the other thing to think of as you're getting into this business is, how am I going to get out of this business? And what's my exit strategy, whether it's 5 years from now or 55 years from now? Because at some point, whether it's handing it off to a wife, to a child, or selling it to somebody else, at some point you're going to exit. And it's never too early to begin thinking about how you're going to do that and to run the business, therefore, in that manner.
And that's great advice. Bryan is not just a good man to talk to, but a good man to have on your team, and I thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Take care.
Thanks.